Hey, what's up everyone? Back with another video, and this video is going to be something that hopefully will be able to help a lot of you guys out, and it's going to be on the Q-Power brakes. Basically just how to, my tips on the way that I think is best and easiest to adjust the brakes, get them to where you need them to be. Also go in a little bit about the hydraulic system, and it's not really anything that difficult, and hopefully this will give you knowledge so you can adjust your brakes quite easily. And if you should have to go so far as to replace a brake line or something like that, you'll get some tips on doing that. Although I would advise against that unless there's absolutely a reason, like it's leaking for some reason, you had an accident or it's broken or something, you have to absolutely do it. Other than that, you can usually just get away with adding a little bit of mineral oil brake fluid to the reservoir, and to improve the feel of the brakes and how far the travel is on the lever. I'll get into that a little bit later. So anyway, that's what this is going to be about. Throughout my other videos, I tend to throw in, little tips here and there. If I'm like working on a rear tire or something, I maybe mentioned tips, some of these tips about the brakes in various other videos. I thought it'd be a good idea if I just kind of made a whole video dedicated strictly to the brakes, so somebody could go there and find out pretty much everything you need to know on adjusting and doing any maintenance with these hydraulic brakes on the Q-Power. Okay, so just real quick, some of the tools we're going to use here today. You may or may not use these. I find these to be helpful. Absolutely, you're going to need to get a set of metric Allen wrenches. This one ranges from, I can't see that bottom one, maybe 1.5 to up to 10 millimeter. But you use a lot of these on the scooter, so I would just get a whole set like this, something like this. Also, if you have some box wrenches, some open-end wrenches like this, metric, of course, again, this one's 8 millimeters. We're going to use that a little bit later. And but just in general for a scooter, like for taking your tires off, your wheels, you're going to need some open-end box wrenches, larger ones. If you can afford it, 8 millimeter up to 20 millimeter would be ideal. That could be a little bit pricey though, so you could just pick out ones that you use often. Okay, also got a rubber mallet here and basically a long nose vice grips, pliers. You may or may not need those. I use them to straighten the rotor, so if my brake rotor is bent a little bit in one place, I can hammer it, mallet it a little bit to bend it in one way, or use those to pull it out the other way, and I'll get to that in a little bit too. So if you have these things, it's great. If not, then just make do with what you have, but you're definitely going to need a set of metric Allen keys. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so the back brakes and the front brakes are identical. Everything's the same between them. So in this video, I'm just going to go over the back brakes, but keep in mind it's the exact same procedure, exact same setup for the front end brakes. Okay, so first of all, let's just say I've got my scooter here and I just want to adjust my brakes. Maybe I get some rubbing. Maybe I don't feel like they're, the feel of the handle's right or something like that. So first thing I want to do is I want to just loosen these two bolts here that hold this red piece, which is your caliper. Your caliper holds your brake pads. That's this red piece. We just want to loosen these bolts. We don't want to remove them. We just want to loosen them so we can move the caliper back and forth. Now you'll notice the caliper, these holes, they're not perfectly round, so they're kind of oval. So there's room, that the reason for that is for adjustment. So when these two screws are loose, this caliper can move back and forth with the extra room in those holes there. So that's what we first want to do, just loosen these screws so we can move this caliper around a little bit. Okay, so I've loosened those two screws with my 5 millimeter Allen wrench, and you can see now that the caliper can move freely in that hole on each side. So the caliper is loose, and this is the rotor, the silver plate that goes in between the brake pads, which are inside the caliper there. So there's a brake pad on each side of this rotor. When you pull on the brake handles, the pads go together, grip the rotor, and that's how the thing stops. So anyway, we've got this loose now, so it's kind of floating over the rotor. Now the next thing we want to do is pull the brake handle for the rear brakes. If you're working on the front brakes, then pull the brake handle for the front brakes. what that's going to do is it's going to make the pads push in to meet the rotor, and at the same time doing that, once you push it and you're holding it and it's tight, it's going to basically use the play in this to adjust the rotor to where it should be right at that point. I mean, to adjust the caliper to where the brake pads are right at the correct point right there. So it's going to kind of self-adjust there. We've got this loose here. We're going to pull on the brake handle. The pads are going to go in, meet the rotor, which is going to kind of move this to a good starting place for adjusting your brakes. I'm going to pull the brakes, the rear brakes, which is the left handle, and you'll see that this kind of moves, the caliper kind of moves a little bit as the pads come out to center it. I don't know if you can see that really, but so I got the handle pulled tight now. Now I'm going to set the camera down. I'm going to tighten those screws little by little. I'm going to do one till it gets snug, the other one till it gets snug, and then just keep going back and forth. You don't want to just crank one down by itself all the way. You want to do it evenly until they're both pretty tight. Then you can release the brake lever. You want to hold the brake lever during the whole time so it's holding that caliper where you want it. Okay, so I've tightened those screws and I released the brake handle, and then I just pumped the brake handle a couple times. And now I'm going to spin my tire and we're going to listen to see if we hear any rubbing. And I don't know if you can hear that, but there is a little bit of rubbing. It's not a lot. It's not terribly bad. You may be inclined just to leave it like this because it's really just barely rubbing. But here's the next thing. So that's pretty good. It's pretty close anyway. And to me, it sounds like it's rubbing almost completely around, which means it's not just, if the rotor, let's say the rotor were bent a little bit this way, then you might hear like a ch, ch, ch every time the wheel goes around. In that case, that's what I use the mallet for. And also these vice grips. And basically what I do is if this were just rubbing in one place right now, that means it's just bent a little bit in that one place. Now this one's not like this, but if it were, I would find where it's rubbing. You can kind of look in between the brake pads there where the rotor goes in. If you put a light behind there, you can actually see, the gaps between the pads and the rotors. But you have to identify which side it's rubbing on, the outside or the inside, by looking in there with a flashlight or something. And once you find it, you find that spot where it's rubbing. Let's say it was rubbing right there. I usually just put my finger right there, and I know the rubbing, where it's rubbing on the pads, is just beyond my finger, so then I can rotate it down here. And my finger's here, so the rubbing would have been, like, say, on this one right here. I'll put that, back straight or something. Now, if it was rubbing on the pad on this side, I'll take my rubber mallet and just bang on it. I'd bang on it a little harder than this. I'm not banging it too hard now because it's not bent and I don't want to bend it. But you can tap on it this way and then just keep trying to roll it some more, see if you did any good or not. And just keep doing that process till you get that one part straightened out pretty good. Now if we're rubbing on the pad on this side, on the inside, then I would take my vice grips here, put it up on the rotor, pretty far down, not right at the edge. I tighten it. If you want, you can put a rag on it so you don't scratch it. I don't even do that. It's not really, scratching it for me. And then you can just simply pry it back out this way a little bit, and just a little bit at a time. Try a little bit. It's hit or miss. You got to try it, take it off, spin it, see if you did any good, go a little more. And that's how you can get out a particular spot that's bent. You can straighten it back to where it's pretty good. Okay, so now in my case again, I hear it like a lot of rubbing. So it's not just rubbing in one place, it's rubbing almost all the way around. But again, it's very slight. So I mean, I almost would just leave it like this and it would work its way in. But I want to show you the next step, and that's adjusting the pad width from the rotors. And you can do that with a little screw up on the handle. Okay, so now up here on the handlebars, right behind the brake lever, and this is the rear brakes again, there's this little screw right here. And it's a 2mm Allen wrench. And this screw, depending on if you turn it in clockwise or out counterclockwise, takes your brake pads and we'll move them either in towards the rotor or out away from the rotor. If you turn it clockwise, turn the screw in, it brings the pads closer to the rotor. If you unscrew it or unscrew it counterclockwise, it brings the pads away from the rotor a little bit. So this is another way you can adjust it. So right now I've got a little rubbing going on my rear rotor with the inner brake pad, I believe. I mean the brake pad on this side, the outside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this counterclockwise so the brake pads back off a little bit. And since I'm rubbing such a little bit, I think I can back it off enough where it will stop the rubbing, and then the brake pads should work normally still. Okay, another thing about this screw, and there's one on each side. Each brake handle has one. Here's the front. And these screws have quite a ways of travel in them. So as you see this one here on mine, it's pretty much lined up even with the black piece here. That's about the midway point. Actually that's the ideal place to be. If you were adjusting your brakes, you could screw that in. I wouldn't mess with it too much unless you have to. And like on some, another one I've seen, the screw is out here further, because that's just where I had to adjust it to get it to not rub and still work good. So there's not really a right or wrong place for this. This again is just about 50%. I mean, that would be ideal, but if yours is out this way, that's fine. If you got to adjust it out that way to stop it from rubbing, or if you need to turn it in further to make the brakes tighter, that's fine too. So that's what the screw does. All it does is it brings the brake pads in close to the rotor if you turn it in clockwise, or away from the rotor if you turn it, unscrew it counterclockwise. It also changes the feeling of the brake lever as you pull it. If you had this real loose, then the brake lever would pull back closer to the handle. If you had it really tight, it would hardly pull back at all. So that kind of adjusts that feeling too. So it's a trade-off between not rubbing your brake pads by adjusting this. That would be the first thing I do. You don't want to rub. I mean, if it rubs a little bit, that's fine. It's going to work itself in as you ride. But you don't want a lot of rubbing, and this is a way you can adjust some of that out. Okay, so on mine, I'm rubbing a little bit, so I want to unscrew this or bring it counterclockwise to the point where I don't hear it rubbing anymore. Okay, so I'm just going to screw this a little bit at a time. You only need to go as far as you need to go, and that would be best. Don't overdo it. Just unscrew it a little bit. In my case, again, I'm trying to get rid of a little bit of a rub. So I unscrewed it maybe 3/4 of a turn there because I got caught under there. So I'm going to remove it. Going to spin the tire again. I still hear a little bit of rubbing there. So I still hear a little bit of rubbing, so I'm going to give it a little bit more. Check it again. It's much better, but it's rubbing a little bit in one place. Now again, I could try to bend that out, but it's so little. I'm just going to go with this and adjust it out just a little bit more. Spin it again. And that sounds pretty good now. So I'm just going to give my brakes a try again. Squeeze the handle a few times. I've noticed it's changed the feeling of the handle. It pulls a little bit further towards the handlebar, but I've got plenty of room there. I'm not coming all the way up against the handle. If you're coming up to here, you'd probably want to adjust it, or you'd probably actually need to add some brake fluid at that point. But it's still got plenty of space there, so I'm not coming too close to the handlebars. And that's going to lock up those brakes anyway, doing that. Okay, so let's spin it one more time. And that sounds good, no more rubbing. So basically, again, I adjusted that screw, I adjusted it counterclockwise, which pulled the brake pads a little bit further away from the rotor, and I did it enough so I didn't get any any more rubbing. So that's the way you can do that, adjust your brakes. At that point, you'd be pretty much done with adjusting them. Now you can see I've adjusted that screw out now, and now it's sticking a little bit beyond the black metal piece there, so it's a little bit out from center. Again, lined up with the black, there's pretty much the middle. It actually will screw all the way in, so you can see how far that'll go. It goes quite a ways, and it will go that much more out to the outside. It'll come out at least this far. So don't worry about where that's adjusted. Just adjust it to where the brakes feel good and where they don't rub too much on the rotor. Again, a little rubbing, I wouldn't worry about it, and that's how you adjust those. Okay, so next, let's talk about the hydraulic part a little bit. Okay, so if you've got the screw here that we just talked about adjusted in, so it's almost all the way in, or it's pretty far, and you still have a very loose lever where maybe the handle can go all the way back and touch this, or it just doesn't feel tight, then you may need to add some fluid, which would help with that issue. So again, you can see I'm not anywhere near that. In fact, I'm adjusted more to the other side. I'm not even midway there. But let's say I had the screw turned all the way in, and again, you don't want to go too far, but you can go at least as far as to where it meets that metal that's screwing into. And I won't go any further than that. But if you're that far in and you're not rubbing, and you're still you pull your handlebar and it's really loose, with that turned in, it should be pretty tight actually, where you can hardly pull it back like that. But again, if you have that loose feeling, you probably could stand to use a little bit of brake fluid in the reservoir. It's not that big of a deal. When I first had to work on the brakes on one of these things, I'd never worked on hydraulic brakes on a scooter. I wasn't familiar with this, or even on a mountain bike. I just have a regular bike. I don't have hydraulic brakes on my bike. So my only familiarity with hydraulic brakes is on a car, and that can be a pain in the butt. I'm sure a lot of you know. So that's why I was thinking, gee, I don't want to mess with this. What if I get some air in the line? Is there air in the line already? Because the handle is really loose. How do you bleed the brakes? I was trying to get information from Kiwa, and about if there's a procedure to bleed the brakes, and I couldn't really get much information. And I looked online for a bunch of stuff and found somewhere. I finally went out and bought a brake bleed kit, and it came with a bunch of stuff. It looked really complicated. You had to read through it. But one thing I did get that I like is I got this syringe type deal. And if you're going to add some brake fluid to your system, you're going to need to get a syringe of some sort. You don't even need a brake bleed kit, because I never even had to bleed the brakes after all. And you just need some sort of syringe, or even an eye drop or something that you can get, so you can put some brake fluid into the system. And you want to use mineral oil. Don't use brake fluid like for a car. Go online and get some brake fluid meant for hydraulic brakes for mountain bikes and such. And it's basically mineral oil braking systems. It's mineral oil. It's not the regular brake fluid like you put in a car. Make sure you do that, because I don't think you want to mix brake fluid in with this mineral oil stuff. Anyway, having said that, let's go back and take a look at this. So basically what you'd have to do, here's a loose one. This is a whole rear system. It's a spare one I have. It's got the caliper there, the hose coming out, that's the hydraulic hose, the hydraulic fluid's inside there. Goes all the way up and then into the brake lever right there. So this part right in the middle here, that's the reservoir. There's actually brake fluid in there. And there's brake fluid throughout this line, and there's brake fluid down in this caliper. And it's a sealed system, so it's all under pressure. If your brake line leaks, then you're going to lose your fluid, and everything's going to, you're going to lose your brakes. These shouldn't leak fluid. I mean, if that's tight there and that's tight there, and your hose is intact, it's not going to leak. So it would be very rare for these to leak. I suppose if you had an accident or dropped a scooter or something, somehow damaged it, then you might have a need to replace this whole line. If you're thinking about replacing your line because your brakes don't seem to work good, but the line's intact, don't do it, because it's not your line. You may need to just replace this handle part. I had one here that I had to replace on on this scooter I was repairing, and basically its problem was when the handle was pushed in, when it was adjusted, it's popping out now, but when it was adjusted where it needed to be adjusted, when the handle was pulled like that, it wouldn't pop back out. And basically what it is when you turn that little screw in to adjust it, this mechanism gets stuck, so it's not popping free. So that was the problem. So I really just had to replace this part. I didn't need to replace the whole brake line, but again, there's a reservoir and there's fluid in there normally. This one, I have drained. You also notice this wire coming off of here with a 2-pin header on it. That's the brake sense connection. Each brake lever has a brake sense wire that comes out of it. Basically, there's a little switch in the brake lever. So when you pull the handle, the switch gets closed. So there's two wires coming to that switch. It's either open or closed. When you pull the brakes, it's closed. It connects those two wires. That goes down to a cable here, and then the other one comes from this side. They both come down to here, and they meet, and they plug onto a kind of like a Y cable that mates both of those into one. So for that reason, if you pull either handbrake, it's going to make that connection and basically connect those two wires going back down to the controller. That's how the controller knows you're putting on the brakes, because the switch is shorting. It's either open or closed. When it's closed, the controller knows you're putting on the brakes, and then it puts on the brake lights. The controller also, if you have the electronic braking turned on, which I highly recommend, and I recommend setting it to 1. I'll show you that in a little bit. Then when you hit the brake handles, you also get motor braking as well as your brake pads. And again, setting that to 1 works perfect for me. 2 seems a little bit too much braking. I'll go over that in a little bit. So that's why you have these brake sense switches in your handles. So it can tell the controller when you're putting in the brakes, so it can put on the brake lights and also the braking with the motors. Okay, so that's kind of what we got going on here. Let's look at our handle on this one. And you can see there's our brake sense switch coming out to that 2-pin header, which again plugs on inside the cable there. Now I'm not going to take mine apart to show you this. I can just show you with this one, sorry, but I don't want to go that far with it, taking mine apart. Okay, so if you had the need to put some brake fluid in this thing, first of all, don't worry too much. I was all worried about, oh geez, I'm going to get air in the line, then I'm going to have to bleed the brakes. I don't even know how to do that. It's not going to matter. A little bit of air in these lines isn't going to matter. And another good thing is these lines here that carry the hydraulic fluid, they're pretty small. So the fluid actually in these lines, even if you were to tip the thing this way, it's just going to drip out slowly. It's not going to pour out very fast. So at most, you could lose a drop or two, and that's not a big deal. You can put that back in if you need to. The main thing is this one with the reservoir, as you can see, has a very open end for that to plug onto. So this is the one is crucial that you keep pointed up, because if you have it this way when you're unscrewing it, all that fluid is going to come out of there. Okay, so I don't want to take mine apart, but I'm willing to take this one apart just to show you that procedure. So basically what you'd want to do, let's say it's this one, and you have to take off anything you have on the side of the brake lever, of course, your hand grips, whatever you have. Then you have to loosen your brake lever. There's one Allen nut over here. Once you loosen that and you fold your handlebar down, you should be able to slide your brake lever completely off the handlebar. You should have enough room if you fold your handlebar down. Might have to drop your handlebars a little bit, but you should have enough room where you can slide this off the end. So it's just kind of coming up out of your cable. Let's pretend this is the one that's on mine. It's coming up out of the cable like that. Okay, so the next thing, you're going to have to open up your cable harness. I know that's kind of a pain in the butt, but you have to. That's not too hard either. You just get yourself some black tie wraps like this so you can reseal it when you're done. Now somewhere you're going to follow this brake line sense wire, and there's going to be one on this side too, so it depends on what side you're using. Let's say we're just only changing this one or adding fluid to this one. I'm going to follow the wire down here and unplug this cable so it's free of the brake sense cable, so that's just hanging loose like that. Now the reason we gotta do that is because when you're unscrewing this, you can't turn the cable, you can't unscrew that cable. So basically you gotta hold that nut with an 8mm wrench, and then you just have to unscrew this bottom part from the hose. Now again, you wanna make sure you're holding this part so the reservoir opening is facing up like that. Don't worry about the hose so much. It's going to have to, you know, be at that angle. I wouldn't even tip it this way a little bit. This is more important than the hose. Keep this pointed up, and then just slowly unthread this. And that's why we had to unplug this wire, because that's going to be spinning around. You can't unspin that with that wire connected still. And then basically we'll be able to remove the hose from here. Again, hold this very carefully, don't tip it, the hose, as soon as you can, and you don't have to panic about it, but once it's loose, just tip it so it's facing up. Have somebody, ideally somebody standing next to you that can hold that and keep it facing up, or you can clamp it to somewhere convenient. I have some, you know, some small clamps I use if nobody's around to do that. So again, don't worry so much about the fluid in the hose, worry more about the reservoir here instead. Always keep this pointing up, because if you tip this even a little bit, that fluid could come out rather quickly. The hose being tipped, it's only going to drip out possibly. Okay, so I got my 8mm wrench to put on this nut here. And now I should be able to unthread this whole bottom piece here. Again, this is the reservoir here. We want to keep that pointed up. We don't care so much about the hose until we're ready to remove it. Once it's loose enough to remove, then I'm just going to take the hose and try to flip it pointing up, you know, as quickly as possible. Again, don't panic, don't worry about it. You're not going to lose a whole lot of fluid out of that if it's pointed that way. So okay, so I'm first just putting a little counterclockwise pressure. Okay, that came loose now. I'm going to set my wrench down. I'm done with that. This is loose enough where I can just hold the cable and unscrew this black piece. Now be careful, again, you don't want to drop this black piece. You want to keep it pointed up. So I'm slowly going to do this. I'm going to switch hands here. I don't want to drop this. I want to keep the bottom piece pointed up, and as soon as it's loose enough, I'm just going to take the hose and point it upwards. There's a little green seal, there's a little green ring on that. That's how I know I'm getting close. I don't know if you can see that on there too clearly. So now I know I'm close. And I think I'm loose. I'm still holding it in place, but I believe it's loose. It's not yet. Got to keep going a little more. Once I think it's free, notice I'm still putting a little pressure there. Okay, I think it's free now. I'm just going to quickly go like that, okay? Now, I didn't even lose anything. I didn't see anything come out of there. I've got both halves separated. Now again, this is a more important one because there's a big opening on top and your fluid can just pour out. At this point here, I would hopefully have somebody standing next to me, which I don't right now, and I could just hand them this hose and tell them, hold it up, don't turn it upside down, and then I would just keep control of this one. And I'm going to have to use a clamp or something here. Okay, so I just use this little clip here to clip that hose up against the scooter so it's pointing up in the air so I don't have to hold on to that. So I got my reservoir here, and if we look down inside it, you can see the fluid kind of shining down there. So it's not all the way up to the top, and it doesn't need to be. But if you needed to add some, if your handlebars were pulling low, you know, felt loose when you're pulling them, like I said, after that screw is adjusted all the way in, you could just add some fluid directly to this reservoir here. And again, I would just use some sort of syringe, even an eyedropper or something. A syringe would be better because you can, you know, force the air out of it. But again, if you're just dropping in here, I mean, obviously there's air, it's exposed to air already, so you're not really gonna, you know, put any more air into it than it's already getting in there. So then you just take this and a syringe or whatever you're using, and again, use the mineral oil brake fluid for like mountain bikes and such, and just add a drop, 2 drops, whatever. You can add, it depends on how bad you think it is. If your handles, you know, if your handle pulls all the way to your handlebar when you put in the brakes, and you got that screw adjusted in pretty far, then you might need to add a few drops. whatever. But you don't need to fill it all the way to the top here. That would be overkill and that would be too much, and then you'd probably have to drain some out after that. And if you should do that, a way to drain that out would just to loosen that nut. When you have it on the scooter, everything's installed, you're like, oh crap, I put too much in it. You'd have to loosen this up a little bit, and just a little bit, and then you can slowly pull on the handle. And because if you loosen enough where it breaks that seal, then you'll start forcing some of the fluid out of here. I did have to do that once too. Put a rag under or something, no big deal. Okay, so that's how you do that. You just add some drops into here. You could take a look at your hose too. Okay, so I just leaned that handle up against there. It's straight enough where the fluid isn't going to come out. So I'm going to take a look at the hose real quick. And if we just look down in the top of that, okay, so there's the hose, and you can see it's kind of probably hard to see on the camera, but the fluid is, it's down a little bit in there too. So there's a little bit room. I mean, you could put a drop in there too, but really, if you put enough in the reservoir and the handle, you don't even got to worry about putting anything in the hose here, as long as you can kind of see it down there. I don't know if you can see that's kind of glistening a little bit. It's down to about where my thumb is there, I think, but that's fine. So that's how you do it. You put some of that fluid into the reservoir, again, keeping everything straight, and then you have to just do the reverse process. Okay, so I'm just going to put this back together now. And again, I want to keep my handle with my fluid in the reservoir facing straight up, and then you just flip it over as quick as possible, put a little pressure on it, and get that green seal lined up straight. Then you can just start threading it on. Again, keep pressure on the hose pushing down just until you make sure it's tight. And once you got it tight on there, hand tight, make sure you take your 8mm wrench, put on that nut, and then make sure that's good and tight, because you don't want that to leak any fluid out. Okay, so that's that. I've done that 3 different times on various Q-Powers, adding a little bit of brake fluid, and then, like I said, the one time I overfilled it, so then I had to, drain some out by loosening that nut a little bit. I just left everything on the handlebar, was able to loosen it a little bit, and then just pull on the brake handle and force a little of that brake fluid out. So anyway, I've done that 3 times and I had any problem with it. Didn't have to bleed the brakes, and then you have to worry about bleeding brakes, and honestly, I don't think it would be a rare occurrence, I would think, that you'd have to bleed the brakes on this scooter here. Now, next, if you were going to replace your whole brake line, let's say your brake line was damaged and you got this new one from Kiwa. This is the rear one, it's got a longer cable. Front one's identical, only it's a shorter cable. And the front one just comes down through your cable, down through the stem, and then out the stem and down to your caliper here. Your rear one follows the same path, only it goes into the chassis, runs along through the chassis here, and then out the rear. That's the motor one, sorry. Out the rear to the caliper there. So if you had to replace one of those, your first step would be you'd have to disconnect the brake lever portion from that cable like I just did. And when you have the cable by itself, you would have to feed that cable. Of course, you'd have to undo all of your cabling here, all of your sheathing, and any, there may be some electrical tape holding wires together, other stuff. You have to free all the wires. You have to get that brake cable that you've now freed from the this part here, and you have to feed that down through the stem. If it were the front, it would come out here and then go down to there. So then of course that would be how you put the new one back on once you remove this one. And if you buy this from Kiwa, you get this whole piece, the caliper, the handle, the reservoir filled with fluid. It's all ready to go. Just be careful you don't dump a lot of fluid out. And then you just put the new one on the same way. You mount your caliper there. Don't worry about tightening it up. Just get it on there. Then run the cable, the hose, the hydraulic hose back up. You'd have to thread it up through this middle here, and then back up, and then screw it onto the handle and put it on like that. The back's even a little bit more trickier because you have to, if you're disconnecting it, you'd have to pull this hose all the way back to the chassis, and all the way up to the stem. Of course, the old one, you wouldn't have to worry about if you're replacing it. You could, literally probably just cut it out. But the new one, you would then have to do the same process. You'd start at the back, you'd have the handle removed. So you just have your hose with the fluid in. You have to try to be careful to not dump too much fluid out. You do got to run it parallel to get it through there. But if you get through the hole and try to point it up, I actually don't think much will drip out of that hose because the hose is so small, you're not going to lose a lot of fluid. Then you'd have to run it all the way back through here, out to the front. You're going to have some sort of a seal on here you're going to have to deal with, and then back up through the stem and over to there. So it's a bit of work if you're going to replace that entire line. I wouldn't recommend it unless you feel you absolutely need to. For example, if the line's leaking, that would be the only reason I would think you'd need to replace that. But you'd have to find evidence that it's definitely a broken hose somewhere. Because if it were just this part you had a problem with, or just the handle, like I did on the last one, I only had to replace the handle and the reservoir. I didn't have to replace that whole brake line. The less you have to do, the better, especially with those brake lines, because you're going to need some patience to get all this undone and get those cables down through the stem, and if it's the rear one, back through the chassis. So it wouldn't be fun, but if you got to do it, you got to do it. Okay, last I want to show you the electronic motor braking setting in the display. So I'm going to go in setting mode by pressing both buttons, and this is only for this display that has the newer 35 amp controllers. Notice there's no color whatsoever, no red button, no blue, no nothing. It's just all dark, and it lights up green like that with silver circle around it, and it's the 35 amp controllers, the newer upgraded ones. This is only for those. Okay, so I'm going into the settings menu by pushing both buttons and holding them. Okay, so I'm at P00. I'm going to go for P09. I'm looking for P01, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is your electronic brake setting. I have it set to 1. 1 is the mid-range, that's good. If you set that to 0, then you have no electronic braking and you're only using your brake pads. So if that's set P09 set to 0, it means the motor braking is turned off. You're only using your brake pads to slow you down and to stop you. With P09 set to 1, it's I guess it's the lower electronic motor braking, which I find to be really good. And then if you set it to 2, it's the high motor braking. Originally I had mine set to 2, and it was excessive braking to me. I was scared I was going to go over the handlebars when I was going fast, and then hit the brakes. It would kind of throw me forward a little bit because it was that strong. The electronic braking and motor braking was that strong when it was set to 2. I backed it off to 1. That's perfect for me. I can tell it's working. It's helping me brake. It's perfect. So for me, setting 1, P09 set to 1, which is the mid-range. 0 is completely off. 2 is high, and I would recommend going with 1. You can experiment with that. Some people maybe would want the extra braking. To me, setting that to 2 was excessive. Hope that answers some questions. Hope that helps you guys adjust your brakes a little bit. It's not really that hard. Don't worry about the hydraulics. If you gotta take that hose off, you're not going to have to bleed the brakes, as far as I can tell. Yet I haven't had to do anything like that. All right, everyone, that's it for this one. Hope you found that information useful to you. And until next time, take care.